Welcome to lecture number 2. Today we'll talk about the transformation of the American West, particularly the regions west of the Mississippi River. We'll talk about the development of the railroads, how free land brought white settlers to the American West in large numbers, and Native Americans, people who already lived out west. One of the most important themes to be explored with this topic will be the role played by the national government in the development of the American West. Knowledge of the acts passed by Congress are crucial to reach an understanding of how and why railroads were constructed, as well as addressing American settlement in the West. The United States government also developed a new policy addressing Native Americans. Overall, there's one thing you may want to consider as you follow this lecture. Were the policies developed by the government positive or negative for the nation overall? A good place to begin would be an exploration of the railroads. Many agreed a railroad tying the west coast to the east coast would be a good thing for the nation, but one of the barriers to its construction would be the tremendous cost of such a project. There were a variety of different barriers in the United States that would make the construction of a transcontinental railroad incredibly expensive. We've got large areas of desert in the southwest. We've got the Rocky Mountains as well as other mountain ranges, so there were several geographic barriers. This map identifies different settlement patterns in the American West. Notice the areas that are gray. Those areas did not have any significant settlement. If they were to build a railroad from California to the East Coast, there would be large stretches of land where nobody even lived. Who would ride the railroad in those areas? So constructing a railroad would be very expensive, and then if you were to operate it, how would you make any profit or money? In order to help offset the cost of construction, as well as to encourage businesses to become involved in this venture, the national government became active, and they passed in 1862 the Pacific Railway Act. This act had several provisions. First of all, it authorized the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroads to oversee the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. This map identifies several of the routes of the early Transcontinental Railroad. The Central Pacific would begin in California, and the Union Pacific would begin in Nebraska. The two would meet somewhere in the middle, probably in Utah. They weren't exactly sure where they would meet up. To help offset the cost of the construction of the railroad, the companies received free land. They received 10, and then later it was extended to 20 sections of land for each mile of track that was constructed. In case you didn't know, one section of land equaled 1 square mile. This meant for every 1 mile of track that was built, the railroad companies would receive 20 square miles of land. This is a close-up of the map that was seen earlier. A checkerboard pattern of sorts was established on either side of the railroad track. The national government would hold on to some of the property, and the railroad companies would receive the other tracts of land. In addition to the free land, the railroad companies also would receive low-interest loans. They received between $16,000 and $48,000 in low-interest loans, depending upon the terrain, for each mile of track that was constructed. This ended up costing the U.S. government a lot of money in terms of the loans as well as the land. However, one thing that's clear is the railroad never would have been built so quickly without these government subsidies. Now that we have the Railway Act passed and its description, I'd like to talk about what happened as they were building the railroad itself. Some problems did develop because of the way the funding was set up. First of all, tracks were sometimes constructed too quickly as the two railroad companies tried to compete with each other to build more track. They received more low-interest loans as well as more free land for each mile of track that was built, so they competed with one another to build the track. Secondly, in some cases, surveyors were encouraged, or maybe even bribed, to describe a terrain as hilly rather than flat, because the railroad companies would then get additional money for those low-interest loans. Another problem faced by the railroads was the lack of labor. 1862 was in the middle of the Civil War, and so there were lots of laborers who were actually in the Union or the Confederate armies. So the Central Pacific began to encourage Chinese to work for the railroad. In fact, 12,000 Chinese, it's believed, worked on the railroad out in the West. Also, members of the Mormon Church were recruited. The Union Pacific specialized in encouraging Irish immigrants and then later former slaves and Civil War veterans to work on their railroad crews. Despite those problems, in 1869, the two railroad companies met at Promontory Point, Utah, and a trip that had once taken between 4 to 6 months might now take between 5 to 6 days. The American West was beginning its transformation. It wasn't just the West that was transformed, but the entire nation. I showed this map a little bit earlier, but look at the different color coding areas. In the east, we see green. In the middle, we see purple. We see tan. And in the far west, kind of an orange color. These identified the different time zones that were established. These were established not by the national government in 1883, but by the railroad companies. It was very difficult to try to get the different railroad trains to come on time in certain areas, so they established standardized time zones on their own in 1883, demonstrating the power the railroad companies had. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad not only impacted settlement in the American West, but it also impacted the nation's economy and environment. Prior to the 1800s, it's estimated there were millions of buffalo in the West. However, by the 1880s, their numbers had dwindled to several thousand. Many factors led to the decreased numbers of buffalo. Here are just a few explanations. First, many buffalo were killed to provide food for work crews as they initially constructed the railroad tracks. A great deal of money was also made by white and Native American buffalo hunters who could collect between $1 and $3 per buffalo hide when they were sent to markets on the East Coast. Buffalo were also an important part of the Plains Indians' economy and spiritual life. Some in the Army encouraged the destruction of the buffalo as a way to counter Indian resistance to American settlement as the numbers of people moving out west increased in the late 1800s. Any search would provide you additional information about the American West, but I've got a few websites here, beginning with PBS, a virtual museum from the city of San Francisco, and the Central Pacific Railroad has several photographs at their website. Many Americans also traveled out west as the government offered free land to people interested in starting over and settling in new areas. The same year the Pacific Railway Act was passed to help with the construction of the railroad, the government encouraged people to move westward by passing the Homestead Act. This had three main points. First of all, adults could select up to 160 acres of land as long as it was surveyed yet unclaimed. Secondly, they had to occupy that land for a minimum of 5 years and improve it in some way. Third, as long as they stayed on the land for 5 years and they paid a nominal fee of $10, the land was theirs. Remember how the national government held on to some of that land and established the checkerboard pattern with their land grants to the railroads? Well, the land that the government had held on to was now opened up for settlement under that Homestead Act of 1862. The government's passage of the Homestead Act, as well as the Pacific Railway Act, combined to have a big impact on the American West, and it showed that the national government was heavily involved in the development of this region. By the way, does anybody know what was meant by improvement of the land? Well, if you cut down all the trees, if you built a fence, if you planted crops, those were all considered to be improvements. The impact of the Homestead Act in the late 1800s really was tremendous. As we see from this image, many of the railroad companies encouraged people to take the rails and to travel out west in order to establish their own farms. It's believed that about 400,000 families became landowners as a result of the Homestead Act. However, many of these families did face problems. Many people traveled westward in hopes of transforming the land. However, what many discovered is that nature provided its own obstacles, which often transformed them and their activities. One characteristic many settlers soon discovered were the low levels of rainfall in many regions west of the Mississippi River. This map identifies different levels of precipitation in the United States. Notice the areas in the eastern U.S. 30, 40, or more inches of rain was very common, and 160 acres of property was enough for a family to have a self-sufficient farm. However, in the areas farther west, they might have only 20 inches of rain. maybe even less. In those regions, 160 acres just wasn't enough for a family to make it. Nature provided a variety of different obstacles as well. As one was working in the fields, large numbers of mosquitoes might swarm around them as they were trying to get their daily work done. Grasshoppers might invade a field of corn or wheat and destroy several weeks or months' worth of crops. The weather proved highly volatile. In the summer, it was incredibly hot with high humidity levels, and then in the winter, there would be huge blizzards with several feet of snow. Also, their homes were very often made out of sod or soil due to the lack of timber, and so there were a variety of things that impacted people's daily lives if they moved out west. The Homestead Act was successful in encouraging many families to become landowners, but not all were successful. It's believed that to be successful, additional money was needed, maybe as much as at least $1,000, in order to purchase additional land or to provide irrigation to that land. Now I'd like to talk about Native Americans in the American West, and particularly look at U.S. government policies toward American Indians. This map identifies many American Indian nations at or about 1500. It's estimated that in that time period, between 10 to 12 million Native Americans lived in areas north of what is now Mexico. By 1900, that number had dwindled to about 500,000. As more settlers moved west as a result of those policies adopted by the national government, they came into conflict with people who were already there, Native Americans. This map identifies some of the major clashes between whites and American Indians out west. As this map shows, Oklahoma was the location of many different Indian nations in the late 1800s. However, as it was opened up for settlement in the latter 1800s and early 1900s, conflicts developed in areas like here and in other regions of the American West. Due to these clashes and conflicts and loss of life on both sides, a new policy was developed by the national government. This new government policy was seen by an act passed by Congress in 1887 called the Dawes Act. The main focus of this new policy was to assimilate Native Americans into American society. The Dawes Act was based on the concept that white American culture was superior to that of Native American traditions. They believed that tribal identity should be destroyed, and the reservation system, as shown here on this map, should be broken up and ended. The Act itself contained several provisions. First, each Indian head of household could receive 160 acres of land to establish a farm, or, if they preferred, they could receive 320 acres of land designed for grazing animals such as cattle. Secondly, additional family members could receive 40 acres of land each. Third, the land was held in trust by the American government for a period of at least 25 years. Finally, participation in this program was mandatory. Now you may be saying to yourself, well, why did this act have to be mandatory? Because American Indians were receiving either 160 or 320 acres of land. Well, let's look at the impact of the act. As a result of the Dawes Act, 2/3 of all tribal land which was held in 1890 was lost by 1930. The reason for this is because any land that was left over following the allotments to American Indians was opened up to settlement for whites. American Indians reacted in a variety of ways to the Dawes Act and the loss of land. I'd like to talk about that next. One reaction among many Indian people was the ghost dance. This was a religious movement that became popular beginning in the 1880s. It was originally popular in the Great Basin and associated with the prophet Wovoka. Whites referred to Wovoka as Jack Wilson. This had a variety of teachings to it, but it was believed that all whites would die and dead Indians would return to the earth if Indians lived together in peace, abandoned white influences, and danced a particular dance. This dance involved traditional songs as well as newer songs. By the late 1880s, the ghost dance had spread to different areas and was particularly popular among the Sioux living in the Dakota Territory. There, it was outlawed by military authorities because it was seen as such a symbol of resistance to the American government. Tension really increased between the military and the Sioux when Sitting Bull was killed when authorities tried to arrest him in December of 1890. Sitting Bull was targeted because he was a leader among the Ghost Dance followers. In late December of 1890, about 2 weeks after the death of Sitting Bull, the cavalry was rounding up many Sioux near Wounded Knee Creek. Shots rang out. In the ensuing violence, about 300 Indians were killed, including 7 infants. In addition to that, 29 American soldiers also died. These events were known as the Massacre at Wounded Knee Creek. 1890 proved to be a low point for American Indians in U.S. history. The Dawes Act had just been passed, and the events at Wounded Knee Creek ended in a resounding defeat for American Indian people. There are 2 hyperlinks here for additional background to the events at Wounded Knee. Several issues have been discussed in this lecture. In conclusion, let's go back to the main theme to see how it was addressed in different ways. This lecture has shown that the American West really was transformed dramatically in the years following the Civil War. One of the main reasons for this transformation would be the series of policies adopted by the American government. One thing that you'd like to keep in mind is, how would you evaluate these policies? Do you think they had a positive or negative impact on the nation's history? Well, this concludes lecture number 2, Transforming the American West Following the Civil War. I hope you learned something new today, and I've got some sources as well as additional hyperlinks to follow this slide. Have a great day.